make sure you can all see it.
Okay, so we're recording.
All right, everybody see that one okay? Hopefully. Tonight's talk is about bird migration. Some of it could actually be, some of the information can be used for lots of different animals that also migrate, but we're going to focus on bird migration tonight. Kind of the what, why, who, and how is what we're going to go through. And I have a bunch of pictures. I have some readings I was going to do to get you thinking about all those feathered friends that are over our heads as we speak or have already been through on their way south. And why isn't it advancing? Oh, there we go. So I want to do a quick reading. This is from The Bird with a Silver Bracelet by Norma Fisk. It's about bird banding. And it'll get you to think a little bit about how birds have been viewed from a historic perspective. People have been interested in birds since the mists of time. They have noted how some live in swamps, some in woods, some in pastures or on the crags of high mountains, some in the eaves of homes, be they castles or hovels. In the 4th century BC, the Greek philosopher Aristotle noted how birds came and went with the seasons, deciding that redstarts changed into robins to survive the winter cold, that swallows survived by burrowing in the mud of ponds and lakes. This belief lived on in a folktale to be repeated by a famous English naturalist of the 18th century, Gilbert White, who wrote of swallows spending the winter in the banks of ponds and rivers. In 1703, another Englishman propounded that in fall, birds went to some invisible aerial island fixed above our atmosphere. Europeans believed, like Aristotle, that some birds changed, cuckoos becoming hawks and so strong as to outface winter. A Swedish archbishop described fishermen drawing up clusters of swallows in their nets and setting them back into the water without warming them, which would cause their unseasonal death. These birds, he wrote, assembled in reeds, where allowing themselves to sink into the water, they would join bill to bill, wing to wing, and foot to foot, thus surviving. So I wanted to give you a sense of that because it's amazing what past naturalists have learned about birds through observation, but we've learned a lot more about where and how birds move through their environment. So what do they know now and how do they know it? Well, a lot of what they know is through field observations, just as those early naturalists had done. But much of it is through sort of modern technology. Bird banding is a technique that's been used since the early 1900s. 1920 is when the official Fish and Wildlife Service took over bird banding. Bird banding is just an attachment of a small aluminum numbered anklet to the foot of a bird. Based on the size of the bird, the band is bigger or larger, depending on how much that bird weighs. Colored bands are used for larger birds as well, so that they can be identified from a distance. There are different patterns of bands that are used to help identify those birds. Birds can be banded on their summer habitats and then recaptured at another site where they winter, and information is gathered from that. Or in the case of the death of that bird, sometimes people find carcasses and they find that band that gives them information about where that bird was banded and where it died. Radar has been used for large flocks of migrating birds. Radio telemetry is a newer technology that's expanding now. So birds can carry small little radio transmitters on their backs as a little backpack or a tail mount or wing mount, and scientists can follow where they're going. Radio towers, cell towers, and then satellites are used to track birds in their various movements as they go around the globe. So the first question probably is what is migration? So it's a form of movement that birds and other animals have. Mostly migration, as opposed to other forms of movement, are seasonal. They're predictable and they tend to be repeatable. So scientists will see it every year and they can predict where birds are going. can be north to south, south to north, east to west. In the case of something like a loon that leaves our inland lakes and ponds and goes to the coast, it can be inland to coast, or it can be altitudinal. If it's a bird that is summering on the higher elevations and needs to move to lower elevations where there's a food source, then it will be altitudinal. So lots of different kinds of movements in that migration, but remembering that it's tends to be seasonal and it's repeatable and predictable. There's other kinds of dispersal is often referred to in the case of young birds. For example, barred owls here in New Hampshire, the young are going to leave their parents' territory at the end of the summer and go off on their own, eventually trying to discover their own territory that they'll use when they become of a breeding age. There are smaller seasonal movements of local birds through their home range. Good example of that would be a chickadee that, the chickadees this time of year are forming their winter flocks. Related chickadees are pulling together in those groups and they're moving around their home range. They may take advantage of different places in their home range depending on the food sources. There are eruptive behaviors. That's usually applied to birds that move in a large area or long distances following food, but not necessarily repeated every year. And scientists can't predict where that individual bird or that group of birds is going to go. Snowy owls are a good example of an eruptive species. They nest in the Arctic, and in the winter, we often see them around Logan Airport or the airport in Portland or some of the coastal areas. Young snowy owls, and mostly females, wander down this way if there's not much in the way of a lemming population up there. So the idea is that they may disperse looking for better food sources. Scientists have found recently that snowy owls wander even greater distances. Some spend time on ice floes in the ocean, hunting ducks and other seabirds. There's a great project called Project Snowstorm that studies snowy owls and where they go and uses modern technology to track them using GPS and satellite technology. There's also the seabirds that will leave their nesting grounds on the cliffs of the coast or offshore islands and wander around at the ocean until they reach their breeding age. Albatross is a good example of that. So there's all kinds of different movements that birds make, but migration is more focused on a predictable type of movement. So the next question is, why do birds migrate? Probably the obvious answer for those of us that are in New Hampshire is that temperatures change, it gets cold, and we get a good snow cover most of the time. For a little hummingbird, it's challenging to maintain that high body temperature of 100 degrees or 104 degrees through the winter. And they need to move out of this area just to maintain their body temperature. And then for some species, snow and ice can limit where they can live. So in the case, again, of the loon, that has to go from our lakes and ponds that are going to freeze over in the winter to the coast. But really the main reason, other than temperature and changing seasons and weather patterns, is that they're looking for kind of the advantage of finding abundant food sources in different places. That's true of many of our thrushes that live here in the summertime. They kick around in the leaf litter looking for insects and other invertebrates. They can't do that so well in the wintertime. So they've got to go somewhere where they can continue to search for those insects and other food sources without a snow cover. We can use the ovenbird as an example. Ovenbird is one of many warblers that are considered neotropical migrants. The neotropical migrants are those that nest in the northern part of North America, up in the boreal forests of Canada, and then winter in Central or South America. They too, like thrushes, spend most of their time feeding in the leaf litter on the forest floor for insects and other invertebrates. They nest on the ground, and they build this beautiful little cup of a nest and then cover it over with leaves and grasses and perfectly hidden. Its name Ovenbird comes from the fact that their domed nest looks a little bit like one of those old-fashioned ovens, domed ovens. So then the next question might be, why would neotropical migrants go south for the winter and then turn around and come all the way back again? Why not just stay down there? So there are a number of answers to that question. One is that there's less competition in the northern reaches of the ranges that they use. For example, New Hampshire has roughly 186 breeding birds. You go to Peru, there's over 1,800 different species. So there's less competition for nesting resources and food as well. We have longer days here in the summer, so well over 12 hours in a day. So that means more time to catch food and feed their young and care for young. Less predators, and our weather tends to be a little bit more moderate than some of the drenching rains of the rainforests of South America or Central America. And then the most important is that we have an abundant supply of insects, which are really protein rich, that many of the migrants come back for to feed their young. If they have lots of protein rich food to feed their young during the breeding season, they're more likely to produce more young. Sometimes the clutch sizes are larger than the southern birds, and sometimes they're able to produce more than one clutch in a summer. If the weather cooperates, they can have 2 or maybe 3 clutches of eggs. So really it comes down to expending all that energy to come back to the north for breeding success. One of my favorite quotes is from a publication by the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, which is a great resource if you want to learn about migratory birds. It goes like this: birds are technologically advanced, highly motivated, extremely efficient, cost-effective insect pest controllers. And it's true. So they're really good at catching insects. And because they're really good at catching the plethora of insects here in the summertime, they're able to raise their young successfully. That's not to say that we don't have resident birds that are fully capable of eating insects through the wintertime and finding food resources. A good example of that is the red-breasted nuthatch and the brown creeper, both insect eaters, although they'll both eat, come to your feeder and eat suet and seeds as well, but primarily insect eaters. The red-breasted nuthatch starts at the top of a tree, works its way down the trunk looking for insects under the bark. The brown creepers start at the bottom and work their way up the trunk of the tree. They each have beaks that are designed to pry under those bark flakes and pull out insects that they can find even in the winter. Those insects hibernating and hiding the winter away can still be found. And then the seed eaters and the fruit eaters, blue jays are generalists. They'll eat just about anything they can find. So they do fairly well in the Northeast in the wintertime. So each bird has its own niche, and some are migratory and some are not. So who are the migrators? Who takes those long or short trips? They're mostly warblers, like the pine warbler and the yellow warbler. And then there are the thrushes that are also migratory birds. Many of the hawks and eagles and falcons are also long or short distance migrators. Shorebirds, you don't think of maybe the woodcock bird because you'll see them mostly around fields and the edges of forest here in the summertime, but that long prehensile beak that they have is designed for digging in the mud for earthworms and other invertebrates, and they need to leave New England and find better foraging habitat to the south. Number of waterfowl species also migrate. And then there are a whole group of aerial insectivores like the tree swallows and the barn swallows and nighthawks and whippoorwills that catch their food in the air during flight. So there are lots of different species of birds that migrate short and long distance again, but the groups are fairly similar, and it's all to find a food source that they can't find by sticking around where their normal breeding area is. So just some numbers to throw out. You can go Google numbers of birds in different places and you'll find all sorts of different kinds of answers. Some are pretty amazing. So there's over 2,000 species of birds found in North America. 7 billion birds is the estimate currently in North America. That's individual birds, not species. There are 286 songbird species in North America. It's estimated that up to 5 billion birds, that's adults with their offspring, migrate south out of the northern boreal forest every year. And then 3 billion birds migrate back north in the spring. So there's lots of different numbers, and it's pretty amazing to think about what's going on over our head, either right now or a couple weeks ago when maybe the height of migration was occurring. Some of the amazing mileage that birds put on. Arctic terns are a bird that's well known for one of the longest migratory flights, 22,000, although there are a number of shorebirds that are pretty close to that, and perhaps they'll get beat out with the more research scientists do. Our little bobolink that nests in our hayfields in the summer here in New Hampshire, 5 to 6,000 miles. Hummingbirds, just to get across the Gulf of Mexico on their migratory paths is 600 miles without rest. Red knot's a shorebird that nests in the Arctic, 18,000 miles. Northern parula, another warbler in our forests around here in the summer, 3 to 3,000 miles, depends a little bit on how far north they actually nest. And red-eyed vireos at 7,500. So think about all those individual birds, all those numbers of birds, billions of birds flying those miles every year. And it's a lot of miles to put together, which is pretty amazing. So I'm gonna use a Blackpool Warbler as an example of some of the athletic abilities of migratory birds. Blackpool Warblers are about 5 inches long. They're a bird that nests in the northern boreal forest in the northern part of the US, all the way as far north and west as Alaska. And then they winter in South America. So they make extraordinary trips, and it's pretty amazing to think about how far they go. So I have another reading for you. This reading is from a book called Living on the Wind Across the Hemisphere with Migratory Birds. And it's written by Scott Weidensaul, who's a wonderful writer and a biologist who shares his love of migratory birds and the information that is written in a way that's really easy to read. It's not too scientific, which makes it kind of fun. So I'm going to read a short 2 paragraphs on Blackpool warblers. And I want you to think a little bit as I'm reading about how extraordinary it is that these little feathered creatures can make this epic journey.
Lynn?
Yes.
You're back now. Your microphone was muted.
Yes, I know. I was trying to get it to unmute. I think I actually hit it by accident. So.
Okay, before the quote.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so he's up in Alaska and observing migration along side of a stream. So the streamside thickets were full of small birds, streaky and tinged with green, Blackpool warblers, 5.5 inches long and weighing barely half an ounce each. You could mail 2 of them for a single first-class stamp. Warblers are a largely tropical family, either as a permanent residence or winter migrants, but the Blackpoll is the most northerly of the clan, breeding from western Alaska across the midsection of Labrador and New England. It's also the most southerly in its wintering grounds, migrating as far as the western Amazon, giving it the longest migration of any North American songbird. That would be remarkable enough, even if the Blackpoll took the most direct course, but it doesn't. Instead, like the American golden plovers, they cross first a continent and then an ocean. As August wanes, most of the Alaskan birds travel east across the boreal forests of Canada, all the way to the Maritime provinces and the coast of New England. For a Blackpoll born on the banks of the Alagnak in Alaska, that alone is a journey of roughly 3,000 miles. While some of them then hug the shore toward Florida, it appears that many Blackpolls strike out south over the open ocean, departing the northeast coast at dusk, ordinarily picking a night with a brisk northerly tailwind after the passage of a cold front. They will need the help. For the next 40 or 50 hours, the tiny songbirds will fly over the western Atlantic, wings buzzing at 20 flaps a second, climbing to altitudes of more than 5,000 feet. They will show up on a weather radar as they pass Bermuda and the Greater Antilles, glowing green specks that form diffuse blobs on the monitors, like ghosts beneath the moon. The warblers follow a curving track, steered and abetted by the wind. At first, the northwesterlies carry them out to sea, the wind's push adding to the 20 miles per hour that the warblers can fly on their own. Midway, somewhere around Bermuda, the northwesterlies fail and the migrants come under the influence of the subtropical trade winds, which blow from the northeast. The tiny birds are shepherded back to the southwest toward South America, finally making landfall along the coast of Venezuela or Guyana, an overwater trip of about 2,000 miles, a passage with no rest, no refueling, no water, during which each will have flapped its wings nearly 3 million times. If a Blackpoll warbler were burning gasoline instead of its reserves of body fat, it could boast of getting 720,000 miles to the gallon. So it's one of my favorite things I think about every year when I'm thinking about how all these birds make these trips. Okay, why won't this advance? Oh, there we go. Okay, so the next question is, sorry about that, is how do birds do this? And what's the trigger? So scientists say that the main trigger for starting migration in birds is the changing day length, which is true for most animals that have to prepare for winter. So changing day length, and then the temperatures are kind of the fine tuning for when birds leave. And then there's the hormones and the genetic propensity for this big journey that they're going to take. They're hardwired, basically, genetically hardwired to go in a certain direction for a certain length of time. Most migratory birds don't follow the adults, although many migrate in large groups and probably take advantage of being together in a group and following each other. But most of the warblers don't go with their parents. Some of the waterfowl species do follow the adults, and some of that migration is learned behavior. But much of it is kind of hardwired in the brain. Some will go during the day, some will go at night. Some will make extraordinary long trips over the ocean, like you just heard from the Blackpoll warbler. Some will make short stops along the way and feed as they go. There's quite a variety and diversity of that. Down in the lower left corner of this screen is an image called Birdcast. And if you do a Google on that, you can go to this site and hit the play button and see how birds are moving through the environment on the day that you are looking at, which I think is pretty extraordinary. That's a Cornell Lab ornithology project, and it's pretty cool. It shows which direction birds are going, where the highest concentration of birds are, and it's a little mesmerizing, and you'll have to watch it a few times to really catch all the time. I have the website for Cornell at the end of this, so you can look at that if you're interested. So the sort of the how-to also includes how birds can find their way. Again, a big part of it is their genetics and their hardwiring of their brain, which I think scientists are still trying to learn about. We've learned a lot over the years, but there's still new things being discovered every day. You can kind of think about how they make that trip by thinking about compasses and maps, much as the same way we would use a compass and a map as we're trying to orient in our backyard or our nearby forests. The sun during the day, for those birds that migrate during the day, is a good reference point that's used. The stars at night, some scientists are investigating more about how the moon might play into that as well. The North Star is another cue that birds may use. And then you might say, well, okay, that's great, but what if it's cloudy and raining? They can't see the sun directly, although there's all sorts of polarized light that we can't necessarily detect, but birds are able to detect. And if the clouds are covering the stars at night, what can they use? So then there's the whole idea of the magnetic field and how birds can use that. All sorts of studies in the past included gluing magnets to pigeons' heads and seeing how that affected their ability to home to their home site. Now scientists are thinking that maybe there's a piece of magnetite in the beak of a bird, or there's a special protein in their eye that is able to hook up with the magnetic field of the Earth. So again, you can Google that topic and you will be amazed at all the different things that scientists are learning about how birds can use the magnetic field to find their way. More of the maps and the navigation comes into play once a bird has at least got to South America or Florida or whatever their southern wintering site is. They may use landmarks, either coastal or mountain ranges, broad river basins. The magnetic field comes into play as well in that kind of closer to home type navigation. Some birds, even though most birds don't have a very good sense of smell, have been shown to use a sense of smell. Petrels will often use that once they get to the nesting islands to locate the burrows that they're going to use, that they came from originally. And then sounds, the ocean sounds, if they're keeping the ocean sounds on their left, in their left ear as they're moving, or their right ear as they're coming back, that's another cue that they may use. So lots of different cues that birds will use, and scientists are still trying to figure out which birds use what, and most birds probably use a whole combination of those different cues to find their way. So as you can imagine, as with most wildlife species right now, and even with some of our more common birds in our backyard that don't migrate, there are conservation issues related to bird populations. Scientists have just come out with a recent study with estimates that 2.9 billion birds have disappeared since 1970. Not species of birds, but just the numbers of birds are dropping. And there's lots of different ideas about why that is. Probably habitat loss and habitat fragmentation is one of the biggest causes for decline for many of our migratory birds. And then on the smaller scale, window strikes, I'm sure most of you have had that happen at your house. Birds that hit the window and see the reflection of the surrounding forest or field in it. Some bounce off and recover, and some don't survive. Domestic cats and feral cats take billions of birds, songbirds every year, as well as other wildlife species. Various toxins in the environment, lead and mercury, are common not only in our fish-eating birds, but also mercury is turning up in songbirds. The Biodiversity Research Institute in Maine has been doing a lot of studies on the amount of mercury in songbirds. And turbines and tower strikes are another issue. Plastics in the ocean, I'm sure you've all read about those. It has a huge impact on many of our ocean-dwelling birds that ingest pieces of plastic thinking that it's some form of food. And then some of our raptors we're losing from rodenticide. So make a plea for you not to use those. I know it's sometimes the easiest way to get rid of the mice or the squirrels in your yard, but those anticoagulants go up the food chain and affect the owls and hawks that live in our backyard. So snap traps might be not so much fun to work with, but they're at least more humane for the rodent and safer for our raptors. So those are all the kind of smaller scale conservation issues. Of course, one of the biggest ones that you've likely heard about is climate change and how climate change affects bird populations. So the biggest, kind of most obvious one is that changing climates and local weather patterns can change the timing of departure of birds or arrival of birds or departure or arrival of the food that they depend on. A good example of how climate change could mess up the interrelationships between different species of birds is the sapsucker and the hummingbird. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers drill little wells in trees, sap wells. That's what all those little holes are in that trunk. You might have seen them in your apple trees or fruit trees in your yard. They drill those sap holes. The sapsuckers eat that sap, and they also eat the insects that are attracted to those sap wells. Hummingbirds return from their southern haunts about the same time as sapsuckers, sometimes arriving before flowers are blooming and red maples are blooming so that they can get the nectar from those flowers. So they depend a great deal on those sap wells. They feed on the sap as well as the spiders and other insects that might visit those wells. So climate change can have an impact maybe on when sapsuckers arrive compared to when hummingbirds arrive. And much of that can depend on also when plants are blooming and fruiting and seeding and things like that. Hurricanes, you've probably heard that climate change has a predicted cause of an increase in the number and intensity of hurricanes. So picture that and then imagine a hummingbird trying to cross the Gulf of Mexico or a Blackpool Warbler headed south over the Atlantic Ocean during hurricane season. So an increase in intensity of those storms can have an impact on birds that are expending a lot of energy to get to their southern haunts or back to their northern breeding areas. Another good example of how climate change might affect two different species. This is another really cool interrelationship between the red knot, which is a shorebird, and horseshoe crabs. Red knots breed in winter in the southern tip of South America and breed in the Arctic. They make a long journey, over 18,000 miles, and depend on some main stopover areas where they can feed to fatten up to make that last push. And I have another reading for you from the same book, Living on the Wind, about this relationship between red knots and horseshoe crabs. Make sure I find the right page. And so horseshoe crabs, if you don't know, winter out in the deeper water and then move inland during March and April to mate and lay their eggs on the sandy beaches. So they're migrating out of the deep water about the same time that the horseshoe crabs the red knots, the same time the red knots are moving northerly along the coast of South America and getting ready to make that big overwater step to the coast of North America. So here's the reading. Try to imagine standing out on the beach in Delaware Bay and making these observations. They're kind of two migration events happening at once. Into this, so he's talking about the horseshoe crabs on the beach laying eggs and the red knots arriving, as well as other shorebirds. Into this melee come the knots, exhausted and starving from their marathon flight. With them are semi-pollinated sandpipers, ruddy turnstones, sanderlings, and other species, perhaps 1 million birds in all, most of them also having just completed long overwater flights from South America. Nothing is more critical to them than a good meal, and they find it, for the crab eggs are a feast beyond measure, even more, enough and more for all the weary birds. As in Brazil, they rapidly gain back their lost weight, patting themselves with fat, because the bay is not their destination, only another pit stop on an annual circuit. Within 2 weeks, they must be airborne again, making another 4 miles to the Arctic breeding grounds. The fat they accumulate here must be enough not only for the flight, but also to carry them through the beginning of the breeding season, when they have more on their minds than food. For this remarkable system to work, there must be an abundance of crabs, an orgy of Roman proportions, and more eggs than stars in the sky. It is not enough that there merely be some horseshoe crabs on the beach, or even a lot. There must be so many that the bay shore seethes with them, like an invading legion, multitudes squandering their biological capital with utter reckless abandon, churning the carefully buried clutches of eggs to the surface where the birds can find them. And even then, with a quarreling, frantic, probing, gobbling crush of 1 million birds that carpet the beach, so that at times one cannot see the sand beneath them. Even then, the shorebirds only skim the cream, the tiniest part of this incredible bounty. In a few weeks, the tides will again rise high enough to reach the surviving eggs and liberate the minute larvae inside, flushing a few generations of crabs into the bay. But by then, the shorebirds will be gone, living on the wind once more. So that's the story, a brief piece of the story of horseshoe crabs and red knots and other shorebirds that stop in Delaware Bay to feast on those eggs. Climate change can have an effect on sea level rise. The sea level rises, where are the horseshoe crabs going to lay their eggs? And then where are those knots going to stop to make that final fat building event happen before they have to go all the way to the Arctic to lay their eggs. And sea level rises can affect a lot of the shore nesting birds, piping plovers and least terns nest just on the sand. They don't build a nest, they just make a little divot in the sand in the upper parts of the beach and lay their eggs. With sea level rise, it makes it more likely that some of the storm surges will wipe out that success of a place to lay their eggs. In the case of warming temperatures associated with climate change, the fish populations may move out of range of the birds that are nesting on the beach or nesting on coastal islands. It's not just the quantity of fish, but the quality of fish, the size of the fish. Atlantic puffins are a bird that doesn't shred up the fish that it delivers to its young in its burrow. They deposit just the right size fish for the young to eat. If they deliver fish that are too big, the young can't eat them and they'll starve. So the bigger picture of climate change on those types of birds has to do with, again, with food supply and rising sea levels. So with that depressing note, I don't want to leave you that. I want to leave you with sort of what we can all do on the smaller scale around our homes, but also to be aware of learning as much as we can about what's happening in the broader environment with these birds that many of whom we share with other states in this country or other countries or other continents. And we can all do our part to help them out. So one strategy is to become a citizen science. There are a number of community science projects run by Cornell Lab of Ornithology and other avian organizations where you can be a citizen science scientists and help contribute data to the projects that help our scientists understand how birds move through the environment and figure out ways to protect them as they go. Feeding the birds in your backyard, paying attention to the kinds of chemicals you use in your yard, or preferably not use in your yard. That's always a good thing to do. Covering your windows, protecting birds from your windows, whether it's a temporary layer of ribbons to keep them from flying into your windows, turning off lights at night, paying attention to those buildings in your community that leave lights on at night. That's another way you can help migratory birds, if you can convince people to turn off those higher level lights that birds will fly into during their migrations. And then something simple like just gardening and thinking about the habitat in your backyard. A beautiful flower garden gives you happiness, but it also provides a place for birds to feed and a place for many pollinators to reproduce. And many of those pollinators and other insects become food for those birds in the summertime. Fruiting shrubs as well are a great source of bird food. And of course, many of those fruiting shrubs have to flower first. And there are a variety of insects that depend on those flowers for pollination. So again, more insects, more birds, more fruit, more birds, and seeds too. So any of the shrubs and trees that produce nuts like acorns and beech and witch hazel and things like that. I'm always in an argument with my family about how much lawn to mow and whether or not to clean up my gardens this time of year. I'm turning into a proponent of having a messy yard and a messy garden and waiting to clean out my garden till the spring. Many of the dead stalks in the garden this year might not look so great, but they're great homes for hibernating insects, which helps the insect population make it through the winter and be a good food source for the birds in the spring. So here are some resources that you can investigate if you're interested in learning more about migratory birds and birds in general, what you can do to help migratory birds. If you want to learn about some of the problems that they're facing, or whatever you want to do, there's some amazing things out there. And some of these sites have some great maps and live streaming maps on different species. Project Snowstorm is a wonderful way to see where snowy owls go, how random their various movements are. It's pretty amazing what you can see from modern technology and some of what's available at these sites. Down at the bottom is the name of the book that I've been reading from. I think you would love the book. I hope you would love the book if you can find it. I'm sure it's on the internet. It's a fun read, and you can learn a lot about migration through that. And then I just want to finish up with two last paragraphs as a summary to get you thinking about what you can be looking for and listening for each fall and spring. Aristotle was, shall we say, a creative thinker, even by the freewheeling standards of ancient Greece. In addition to declaring that horsehair turned into living worms, he believed that birds hibernated in holes in the ground each winter. It's easy to laugh at Aristotle because we know better. The truth about migration is that birds are conjured from the soft April air of a Gulf Coast sky. The blue is rolled up to things and cerulean warblers. The fog folds in on itself to birth gray catbirds and gnatcatchers, while the orange clouds at dusk give of themselves to create orioles. And the liquid gold of the afternoon sun is measured out, drop by precious drop, to form male prothonotary warblers. Once the sky is full to bursting with these new-made wonders, it lets them fall like snow on the land. Poetic hogwash, you say? Suit yourself. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing, and happy to answer any questions that I might be able to answer. If I can't, I'm sure that I can send you to resources where you can find the answers.
Lynn, do you want to take a look in the chat box? There's several questions there.
I see them. So I'll start at the top. So the first question is, they find insects under bark by smell. That's a good question. I don't know definitively the answer to that. I'm going to guess that it's mostly by hearing. Birds have an incredible sense of hearing. And I know woodpeckers use hearing. I don't know about smell. Most birds don't have a very good sense of smell, so that's why I'm leaning more towards the hearing aspect. But that's a good question to Google and see what you can find out. Oh, cool. Cook Library has a copy of the book, so go check it out. Any tips on how to attract grosbeaks? Grosbeaks are one of those birds that tend to be one of the eruptive species. They move around in large ranges. And I don't know as I have any tips to attracting them every year. Having a diversity of different seeds is always a good way to get diversity of birds at your feeder. So, millet, black oil seed, larger sunflower seeds, nut morsels, things like that is a good way to get diversity. But I think you'll find that you won't see grosbeaks every year. You may see them every year or every few years. So here's a good question. Are you referring to veggie gardens when you suggest letting them go till spring? Actually, I've done that too. Sometimes I take the leftover veggies and just dump them in the soil, and I kind of mix them in and let them decompose. Sometimes I pull them out and put them in my compost pile, which also is a really good insect factory in many ways. Last year I let my kale go, and it resprouted this year, and I didn't have to plant any more kale, which is kind of nice. So anytime you leave any kind of plant substrate behind, I think it has the potential of being a good home for various species of insects. Okay, so here's a good question. If 5 billion go south and 3 billion come north in spring, what happens to the rest? So that comes back to the conservation issues that I described. Nobody really knows what happens to all the billions of birds that don't come back. Juvenile birds don't have a very high survivorship. Young birds the mortality rate of young birds is relatively high. For example, in raptors, 80% of first-year birds die in their first year. So there's inexperience. There are conservation issues along the way. Imagine having to fly all the way from Alaska to South America, and all the different things that you're going to encounter on the way that risk your survivability. So it's generally thought that those, the 5 billion that head south are the adults and the young of that year that they just produced. And then the ones that don't make it back are the ones that, don't survive their ocean crossing or don't survive the windows over some city that they're flying over in a fog, or cats, or whatever any of the other issues are. Hope I answered that question. Someone just agreeing that messy lawns and gardens. I think that's it. Anybody else have any other questions I didn't get to or that come up? You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask. I don't see any. So thanks everybody for joining us. I appreciate it. And I hope you'll be intrigued enough to go in search of lots that there is to learn on the internet, in books, at the library, wherever you can find it. And hopefully if COVID is settled down a little bit by the spring, we can have some bird walks and go out and enjoy our flush of migratory birds as they come back in May.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you,
Welcome.
Mary. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, Mary.
I don't know how to get us back.